Welcome to Nameless Debate Radio, where radioactivity is contagious. You can join us in broadening our minds on the Nameless Debates Discord via the link below and even feature here yourself, if you've got what it takes.
What's up, Rev Dev? How you feeling?
I'd say I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, you feeling ready to get knocked out of your own tournament?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
So the topic of today's debate, is it okay to punch a Nazi? On the affirmative side, we have InSync, arguing that it is okay to punch Nazis. And on the negating would be Unban Rev. Each participant gets 5 minutes for each of their opening statements, and then we move on to open discussion. I think that would probably be the format for this debate.
Yep, and then we'll have 5-minute closing statements or maybe not 5 minutes, but we'll have some closing statements near the end, yeah.
All right.
Then audience questions, and then
Just tell me when you want to start.
Yeah, I'll just start speaking.
All right.
We are here today to discuss the controversial issue of whether it is acceptable to punch a Nazi who you see on the street for no other reason than that you know him to be a Nazi. In order to successfully identify someone as a Nazi, you need to have evidence that they support a hateful and intolerant ideology which seeks to exclude all those who are deemed impure. And therefore you must have some record either of their speech in support of such ideas, or you must be able to identify them by their loyalty to certain symbols. It is hard to see why someone would, for example, have a swastika tattooed on their chest if they do not have some particularly pernicious intentions for the world. In situations where such individuals are beginning to gain social influence, one might imagine that it is enough simply to refute their arguments and thereby win the war of words. Yet, this doesn't work in a contest with people who subvert the basic principles of dialogue, playing an optics game which is designed to be charming rather than logically cogent. Their arguments are ethos and pathos focused, with an extreme emphasis on pathos. They use certain historical symbols ritualistically in order to imbue their cause with a sense of nobility, and they manipulate the crowd, stirring them up until tensions have reached a fever pitch and they are frothing at the mouth to do something. Anything to concretize their shared convictions, feeling as they do that they are one in mind and body, a great leviathan which will smite that which irritates and corrupts the soul of the state. They understand well the basic human reality, that when negotiation fails, we always resort to violence, and the primitive part of us therefore becomes a part of the mob. Of course, I am as valiant a believer in freedom of speech as any other man. However, there are types of speech which do not fall under the kinds of protections this typically entails. One notable example is that of threats to commit violence. However, it is not limited to violence, because we can see in the notion of conspiracy to commit a crime, which is itself a crime, that speech can contain a plan of action which, if executed, would be a violation of the law. In these cases, the speech itself can be considered a violation of that same moral code, because it gives evidence of what the individual plans to do, and, significantly, we need not wait until the crime has been committed to act on this knowledge about what the would-be criminal is planning to do, if he can manage to pull it off. Similarly, it is foolish to wait until the fascists have seized power before being willing to defend yourself with violence, because at that point it will simply be too late. We have an obligation to prevent those with malicious intentions from acting them out, and our responsibility extends beyond a mere contest of words in some cases, because some words are not just words. They are a call to action. Here I think my opponent might agree with me, in that if and when a Nazi is spouting their toxic rhetoric, he might think it is acceptable in that instance alone to assault them. Disregarding the way this undermines his otherwise apparently principled position, it is not clear why we ought to wait for an individual to begin to enact their plans before we take action to stop them. In fact, with something like a fascistic government, once such people are in control, they will abuse their power to brutally suppress any resistance to their rule. Not only will it be nigh on impossible to organize any kind of revolutionary movement, but even the very act of voicing dissatisfaction with the state can become punishable by law. Fascism is famous for its suppression of political dissidents, and consequently it is incumbent upon those who would resist to act before it is too late. This is the paradox of tolerance, the notion that, although tolerance is indubitably a virtue, if taken too far, it enables the worst kind of horrors imaginable. Being tolerant of people who are fundamentally intolerant of others not only involves failing to speak out against their evil actions, but it constitutes standing back and letting them have their way. This is something I believe we as a society cannot afford to do, and further, it is something I as an individual simply will not allow. I refuse to allow those who would poison my country and kill my kinfolk to acquire the kind of power which will let them do exactly as they wish. If it is a game of intimidation, then I can play that game too. In my mind, the notion that one ought not to punch a Nazi unless he is here and now advocating for his view is not a sign of integrity, but a sign of cowardice. And for this, I simply cannot stand. Time.
Right, I guess I can start. There exist many supposed justifications for enacting personal peoples whose ideologies are generally considered abhorrent. However, all in all, these justifications fall flat on their face for numerous different reasons. Simply put, the idea that the best way to respond to ideologies that you deem to be hateful is to go out and enforce vigilante justice is not only wrong, it is also ineffective and potentially causes more harm in the fact that it fails on even the fundamental level of stopping the growth of an ideology. When you put yourself on the street and go and punch someone who you disagree with, you are actively harming. People are not going to be swayed by the fact that you have the ability to harm people on a whim. The people promoting this hateful ideology will use your irrational violence in their rhetoric to promote the idea that people who disagree with them have no argument, no reason, or counter to the claims they make. They will use you as an example of the other side being barbaric and desperate to stop an ideology that they are now able to show being violently repelled by the people who are trying to hide the truth of reality, whether that be race realism, white nationalist, genocide denial. Their arguments will be strengthened in the eyes of their potential converts. If you truly believe they are being an active and imminent threat to a well-being of a nearby community, say, for instance, a collectivized attack, call authorities and let them handle the problem. Violence like this should only be used as a last resort, say, for instance, calling for and actively planning a mass shooting or violence against someone that the authorities have failed to stop. The best thing to do with these ideologies is to make them look ridiculous and prove them to be wrong in their faith using rational arguments. To ignore them entirely. Violence will not stop the spread of violent ideology. Time.
You still got time. Unless
Well,
you wanted to stop there.
well, no,
This is
yeah,
a few minutes.
I was saying I'm stopping.
Okay.
So initially you said like vigilante justice is not only wrong but counterproductive, but in fact there are certain situations where we don't think vigilante justice is wrong. So for example, there are situations where a father walks in on his son being molested by a pedophile and then he reacts violently and beats the pedophile to death. There are numerous cases of such instances where the father isn't actually charged with something criminal like murder, and sometimes they're not even charged at all. So it seems like on the face of it just wrong to say that we always think vigilantism is not morally acceptable. And the idea that for instance, like punching a Nazi or vigilantism, whichever you want to call it, is counterproductive, I think is quite ludicrous, actually, because obviously like a physical consequence for advocating for hateful ideology serves as a deterrent for other people who might do the same.
Okay, the difference between having someone molest your son and having someone spout out Nazi rhetoric is one is a violation of bodily autonomy. It's a violation of, it's directly hurting the person involved, right? And generally, when you have a Nazi that has that is spreading ideology, they are not hurting any one individual person, right? So it would see, you also have to look at the opportunity cost of using rational arguments or violence those situations. There is no rational argument to be had about someone molesting. We know as humans that molestation is wrong inherently, but there are some people who are able to be convinced by Nazi ideology through their rhetoric, or so be it. So it would seem like rational argument, if it can counter that rhetoric, would be better than simply violence, where the people who can be convinced by this ideology will see not a coherent counter to this ideology, but a irrational attack on someone who is seemingly only saying on its face like rational arguments. See, you don't realize the fact that Nazis, most of them, even if they know if you know they are a Nazi, they don't generally say, "Oh, the quiet part out loud." They dog whistle. So if you punch someone trying to dog whistle, even though you know they're a Nazi, other people may not know they are Nazis, and you just hurt your cause by doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about rational argument. I guess it really, that point sort of pivots on whether you would consider arguments in favor of an ethno-state or in favor of ethnic cleansing, in favor of the killing of homosexuals. Is this rational? Are these rational arguments? I would argue no. But the point of the analogy about the pedophile was just to illustrate that, in fact, we don't always think vigilantism is wrong, right? And like,
well, I can elaborate
interestingly,
on that point. Vigilante
well,
justice is
quickly before
wrong
you
on
do that.
people who
Yeah.
vigilante justice is wrong on people who are not attacking someone like inherently.
Well,
Right. So,
you've already explained this though when I talked about conspiracy to commit a crime, right? Your verbal speech acts, things you write down, they can be used as evidence about your intentions to do certain things. And the point about conspiracy to commit a crime being a crime is we don't always have the standard that you have to have done it first for us to do something about it. And you're also, it seems like you're trying to draw a distinction between like the pedophile molesting a child and the Nazi, and saying that the Nazi isn't inherently doing anything violent, but the ideology for which the Nazi is advocating, the realization of this man's ideal world, would require the violent removal of my family, at least, and potentially many other families from their homes, if not their actual execution, right? So to me, like, the idea that there's something like somehow non-violent about it because we're just at the talking stage, I see that as ridiculous, right? To me, if what you're talking about is something that entails killing my family, then my violently opposing your advocacy seems prudent at the very least.
so you're misunderstanding my dog whistle point. Generally, when a Nazi is speaking, trying to convince people of their ideology, they are not going to be actively campaigning for genocide, because that obviously looks bad on its face. They are going to use dog whistles that necessarily don't have the same negative context in it for a general population than, let's say, uh, advocating for a black genocide in the U.S., right? So they aren't going to they aren't going to seem like a Nazi to like people who don't know them, right?
I don't
So
really care how they seem. It doesn't seem relevant to me how they seem. And but to your point about optics, I agree with you.
Because it's relevant because if they see you putting yourself out there to stop them from saying this, while their arguments seem rational to the general public, you are going to make it seem like the opposition has no argument. You're going to draw more people down that pipeline and becoming, and you're creating potential.
Not necessarily, because obviously after I've punched the Nazi, I still have the capacity to speak up. I still have the capacity to engage in a deconstruction of the dog whistling. But to your point about optics, it seems to me puzzling that you would describe like their arguments as seeming reasonable or seeming rational or something like that, when, as you say, they're essentially doing everything they can to obscure what they're actually rationally proposing. They're playing an optics game. So, but your general like thought is that somehow you'll be able to reason with them, reason with people who aren't interested in the game of reason. Now, how are you going to accomplish that?
It isn't about convincing the people who are Nazis to stop being Nazis. It's about making them look as ridiculous and stupid as possible so other people do not become Nazis.
Yeah,
I
but you
don't
won't
think
be able. That's the thing is, because they're playing the optics game, good luck with that. That's exactly what they excel at. If you are arguing for something truthful and the other person doesn't really care about being truthful or honest, then you're at a disadvantage. The chances that you're going to be able to make them look silly is significantly lower, actually.
if okay, so what I'm saying is that violence is not going to convince people to not be Nazis, and there is
That's
effective
that's
ways to
totally
counter.
untrue. It
There
is a
is effective ways.
deterrent. It is a deterrent. When you see someone get punched for publicly advocating for something that you think is kind of reasonable, and you see them get smashed in the face, you might think to yourself, fuck, that might happen to me. That's called a deterrent, and absolutely it could prevent their radicalization.
So deterrents for thinking aren't really effective.
We're not talking about, I didn't
This
say anything
goes
about thinking. I
downstream
never
from
said anything about
this.
thinking. I spoke about public advocacy.
Well, public advocacy, it's not effective because when you take it to the extreme level, the death penalty, one of the main arguments for that is that it's a deterrent. But the death penalty does not seem to deter people from actually committing that crime. Same with, if you see someone
I
punch, you're
don't,
not going to think,
yeah,
oh, that person is wrong. They're going to think
that doesn't,
this person is not going to. This person is right, but they're being suppressed by general society. I'm going to look into them more. And on your point about not being able to counter dog whistles, the way Nazi dog whistles work, they'll say statistics that seem reasonable on the first, but they will make extravagant extrapolations about these claims. Stuff like 1350, racial IQ differences,
yeah, no,
disproportionate Jewish controls over many powerful
that's a,
industries. But you can explain these with more simple and convincing arguments than what the Nazi proposes.
yeah, so that's a very narrow notion of dog whistles. Dog whistles certainly do not always take the form of like quoting statistics and then like, let's say, misrepresenting them or something. But your first point seemed to me to just be on the face of it absolutely ridiculous. The idea that the death penalty itself doesn't serve as like enough of a deterrent to stop people from doing certain crimes. I mean, are you honestly going to support the view that laws and punishments don't deter at all criminal behavior? Is that really what you're going to go with?
Well, it's not my claim. I'm saying that it's not going to you punching someone and a person
I mean,
being sentenced to death is obviously not an equivalent deterrent.
it's not a question of whether it's equivalent. The question is whether, in fact, deterrents work. It seemed like you were using the argument about the death penalty to suggest, very erroneously, that deterrents do not work. But they do.
They do not work as effective.
It doesn't matter. Well, that's the thing is, if the war of words isn't effective, then we don't. Yeah, this is kind of the baseline of society. When negotiation fails, we always settle it with violence. That is the human way.
I'm saying that is the human way does not inherently make something right. There are effective ways to counter.
What I'm trying to explain is there's no other option. Once your ability to win the contest of words has failed, right? You essentially don't have another option except recourse to violence. Why don't you explain to me what other option there is?
simply ignoring them. Violence will
Wow, yeah,
create more Nazi, because I'm
that is
saying
brilliant.
I
Yeah,
would say
simply ignoring them.
okay, I would say that the Nazis will use this rhetoric, and it's a it's a better counter to the deterrent than you would initially say. You're saying that the deterrent of being punched in the face necessarily negates their rhetoric of claiming that people,
No,
their
I'm not saying it
political
negates any
enemies.
rhetoric. I'm not saying it negates any rhetoric. I'm saying it's a concrete example of why it's a bad idea for other people to advocate for this. Yeah. I mean, have you ever, just out of curiosity, have you ever been doing something to other people and then you get punched in the face for it? You kind of reconsider your actions, and anyone who's watching who would also engage in that behavior is also going to think twice about displaying it in front of the person who punched you.
Okay, so most of the time when someone is punched in the face for something that's not generally politically relevant, it's just being like is like generally being an asshole to someone, right? So
Yeah,
but
or for
an
instance,
asshole is
threatening
generally
someone's
accepted
family, or
to be like bad in the general sense, right?
yeah,
So,
or for
but
instance, threatening someone's family, for example.
the general Nazi rhetoric isn't going to threaten someone's
Sure it
family
is. Sure
on
it
the
is.
face of it.
I have a lesbian in my family. Lots of people have mixed race people in their family. If the Nazi ideology is instituted, the consequence of that is precisely that my family gets persecuted, that other families get persecuted. Like, I don't understand this distinction you're making between advocating for an idea, the adoption of which would entail serious violent consequences, and committing violence. This is the same distinction I made before between conspiracy to commit a crime and the actual crime. You're just as liable for conspiring to commit a crime.
Okay, so what I want to say is basically, I'm not saying that punching someone. Could you reiterate what you said?
Uh, no, I can't. Yeah. Sorry, I started reading my notes again, so I don't quite. Um, yeah. Um, Oh yeah, I said I said there's no difference between advocating for an ideology which would entail, let's say, the violent execution of my family, and planning to violently execute my family. Those are identical.
It would be identical to you, but it wouldn't be necessarily clear to the people who are already listening to this person say stuff that's not really advocating for the killing of your family or whatever
After I
in that
punched them,
situation.
dude, after I
It's not
punched them, I'm able to clarify what the meaning of what they said was. So I don't see, you keep appealing to this idea that optically it looks bad, but I think I can counter that just by explaining myself after the fact. Why did you punch him? Well, you see, because if you actually analyze what he said, it entails that he wants to execute my family. And it's pretty straightforward how it entails that. Yes, it's a dog whistle. I saw through the dog whistle. I decided I'm not going to tolerate you threatening my fucking family, and I hit you. I think most people would be on board with that, actually.
I don't think people would necessarily follow through with you saying that's a dog whistle. Like if someone says 1350 and you punch them in the face and saying they're gonna
No,
they're
well,
gonna
that's the
kill your
thing. Again,
family.
that's not a good
That's not
example of a dog whistle. Dog whistles are not just where you quote a statistic. Dog whistle is any kind of statement you make where you're concealing the meaning you intend, right? Like
right.
when you're saying something that appears innocuous, but actually entails something quite charged and negative. That's a dog whistle. It's not The notion of a dog whistle is not bound to quoting statistics, dude.
Obviously, it's not bound to quoting statistics, but that's generally how it goes. Even if it's
No,
not a statistic,
definitely
even
not.
if it's
For
not a
example,
statistic, you could
dude, for example,
you
that
punching
Pepe
them in the
OK
face will
sign.
make you look ridiculous. It's not going to make
Dude,
them look like a Nazi.
I don't agree with you. For example, the OK sign, right? The white supremacist meme, Pepe OK, right? No statistic there. That's a very well-known dog whistle. And most dog whistles actually do not involve statistics.
Are most dog whistles well known to the general public? Keep in mind, we're talking about someone spreading this
This is the thing is,
ideology
they
with
may not
dog
be,
whistles. And
yeah, it may
if
not be
someone
common
if someone
knowledge.
does an okay sign and you punch them in the face, why would they
Again, this
necessarily
is what I mean
believe
is that is not the kind of dog whistle which I would punch them in the face for. That's exactly why I'm drawing the distinction.
So what
If
would be a dog whistle that you would punch them in the face for?
Okay, so for example, if they talked about ridding the country of undesirables, and they don't mention that what they mean by undesirables is homosexual people, mixed race people, and so on.
Again, undesirables, what they'll do is obfuscate, however you pronounce that, hide the fact by not saying only undesirables. They'll just say like, let's give an example: criminals,
No, yeah. This is
rapists,
what I mean
child
is,
molestations.
dude,
If
no,
you
that's
punch them
not
in the
dog
face, you're
whistling.
going to look
It has to be
ridiculous on their
ambiguous.
face.
Dude, for it to be a dog whistle, it has to be ambiguous.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so our Republican senators not dog whistling when they say like, oh, we're trying to stop like child rape, we're trying to stop these rapists, and they're actually trying
Yes,
to
they
talk
are,
about trans people.
because it's ambiguous as to whether they mean pedophiles or transgender people.
But it doesn't
No,
have
it's the ambiguity. Dude, it is the ambiguity that makes it a dog whistle. That's how it works.
It's not just ambiguity, it's the hiding of the fact. It doesn't have to be
Yes, but the hiding is only
ambiguity. It can be obfuscated.
You can only accomplish the hiding with ambiguity. That is how it works.
No, you can say words that mean something else, but if you can say definite words that mean other definite things, but they won't know that until they get deeper down in the pipeline.
That's the definition of ambiguity. That is the definition of ambiguity, dude.
You're saying like them saying like, oh, these pedophiles, these rapists. You're saying that's not ambiguous to what they mean.
No, I said it is. Listen, I said it is ambiguous in the case of, let's say, Republicans. Okay, but when, for instance, or it maybe if what you're saying is, oh, well, even the Nazis are referring to trans people, then yeah, even in that case, yes, it's ambiguous. I don't think this is fruitful to the topic. Like, we should move back onto the main. But I'm telling you, dog whistles always rely on ambiguity. There's no question about that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I sort of mentioned this before. But like, and I didn't feel like you addressed it properly, because you basically said, well, just because this is how humans do act, that doesn't mean it's good. What I tried to explain is it's inevitable, actually. Your proposal of ignoring them just enables them. That's literally all it does. If you ignore Nazis, you allow them to get power, and once they've got power, it's too late. So I said, okay, if you can't win the war of words, then violence is your only option. What's another option? And you said just ignore them, but just ignoring them results in them potentially getting power and coming to kill my family.
This was paired by my argument to saying violence will necessarily cause more harm than good, and it wasn't meant to be taken on its face of the.
I think that statement is straightforwardly
it was an opportunity cost.
The statement that violence necessarily causes more harm than good is straightforwardly false.
I'm saying it causes more harm than good in retrospect to punching a dog whistling Nazi.
Well, that's just special pleading. You're saying it applies in this specific situation, but the general principle is not sound.
It's not special pleading if it's
It is.
true.
The general principle is not sound. So you're just saying, well, this is a principle that applies only in this situation. That's not really how principles work.
It's not a principle, it's a general observation.
Well, no, it is. There's no distinction to be made there. Okay, it is a principle. The idea that violence necessarily causes more harm than good is an ideological principle to which you subscribe, to which I do not subscribe.
It's okay. If I were to give the example of violence being the answer sometimes and other times would, that's not ideologically unfounded. That's not a contradiction. It's just observing what happens in.
I don't understand the analogy.
No, I'm saying I have the ability to say violence is the answer in certain situations, but I also have the ability to say violence isn't the answer in other situations.
Dude, yeah, no, but that's not. Listen, though, the statement you subscribed to just now was violence necessarily causes more harm than good. So no, because of the way you formulated that, you don't get to make exceptions.
Okay, well, I formulated differently then.
So you're moving back on that. So you do make some exceptions. Sometimes violence is justified. Good, we agree. So what I'm saying is the situations that human beings unanimously and historically consider violence to be justified is if the negotiation has failed. If the negotiation has failed, the question is who is going to succeed in imposing their view on the other. That's the end result of a failed negotiation, and that always boils down to violence. And I'm sorry, but if it's a question of imposing my ideology on a Nazi or having a Nazi impose his ideology on me, I'm going to stand my ground.
All right. I can just reiterate my, main point, right?
Sure, if you like.
Violence when attacking dog whistling Nazi does not, it makes your situation worse instead of better because the Nazi's rhetoric is stronger than your fist.
I don't agree. My fist acts as a deterrent to anyone who takes the Nazis' rhetoric seriously. And not just that. If it's not just me who's using my fists, if my view were the common view, I guarantee you Nazis would not be game to advocate in public for their belief.
Okay. So in that case, if we have a society that was dead set on stopping Nazi growth from all right. So why exactly would it be better to enact violence on them as a vigilante rather than enacting laws that make it so that their hate speech cannot, if they are planning to do something, their hate speech would necessarily get them arrested?
Well, that's the thing is, if we want to, develop laws as well, sure, I'm cool with that, man. But like at the end of the day, in edge cases where the law doesn't really do a good job applying, we usually, this is what the example I made to begin with, vigilantism isn't always bad. So with respect to Nazis, right, like my point of view is like, well, it's up to the law to evaluate whether your vigilante action was in fact justified. So I'm confident if and when I choose to punch a Nazi, it will be justified, and it's up to you to decide when it would be justified for you.
Vigilante every crime and say that's
No,
justified. If you can't
no,
break
again,
into
listen
someone's
to what I'm saying. Listen to what I'm saying, okay? I'm confident in my judgment, okay? It's up to you to decide what warrants a violent response in a situation you're confronted with, and I trust the judicial system to deal with you and to determine whether, in fact, your action was justified. And if it wasn't, guess what? Consequences. As far as I'm concerned, if the realization of another man's ideal world, right, would necessitate the suppression of my freedom of speech, he's already forfeited his own. Okay, the fact that his ideology, what he's advocating for, entails stripping me and mine of my human rights, means that the fact that he's advocating for stripping other people of their rights means that it's justifiable to strip him of his.
When all the communications channels break down, sure, but you seem to be saying that the communication channel breaks down right at the point where he's speaking rather than
Yes.
later on.
Yes, I already covered this because he doesn't care about the norms of dialogue. Yes, because he's playing an optics game, and because if you're playing by the rules and someone else is cheating, you won't win. That's just kind of how the world works.
If let's say there's a Nazi talking on the street, it would be safe to say that, given he's dog whistling, but those dog whistles are trying to convince an argument. The dog whistles that you say you would punch them aren't actually like convincing people of anything. Like, you say take out undesirables.
I think you would be very surprised at how amenable people are to the notion of getting rid of undesirables. Everyone has a notion of what counts as an undesirable, and someone validating the idea that those people shouldn't be included in society, that is a much more popular idea than you seem to think.
Well, no, I was going to make the argument that that is popular, yes, but you putting yourself out there and enacting violence on them is going to make your position less popular. It's not going to make it more popular. If
Yes, it's going to make
undesirable, if saying undesirable,
I mean, it may make my
common
position. It may make my position less popular, but it will also make his position less popular. And as far as I'm concerned, I can mitigate the loss to my position afterwards with words. Whereas I think being bested in the, like, let's say, might makes right arena, I think actually that undermines his position. I don't think it reinforces it.
Well, everyone has a notion of undesirables should be eliminated from society, whether or not they may be whatever that is. But that's a common idea. Punching someone in the face and saying that's a dog whistle, that's going to strengthen. They're going to use that violence against you.
What do you think it means? What do you think it means? What does it entail to suggest undesirables should be removed from society? It entails a lot more than a punch in the face. Okay? As far as I'm concerned, that is a very mild response. So one way to think about it is, I am showing him the consistency of his system. If, in fact, it is acceptable to just try to eject undesirables from society, that's what I'm doing. That's what the punch is. The punch is saying, you, motherfucker, you are an undesirable. How's that?
It seems like an emotional argument not fueled by any logical or
I don't know
reasonable
what that
desire.
means. I don't know what that means. Do you know that pathos, right, which is emotional appeal, is an aspect of persuasion? Like logos, logical argumentation, is one of 3 aspects of being persuasive.
I would say punching someone isn't really being persuasive, but you can make that.
Well, no, what I'm
argument.
pointing out, you're saying it's an emotional argument, as if that somehow undermines it, but an argument that like takes advantage of passionate feelings is a good argument. And like I said, if someone, I think a lot of people would feel solidarity with me seeing me punch the Nazi, and even more so once I explained why I did it. And I would get that opportunity.
I just don't think that's true. We're working off the assumption that only you know what they're doing. Only you
I'm not
know
working
that
off
they're
that
dog
assumption.
whistling.
This is what I'm saying. I'm not working. You asked me before, is this common knowledge? No, but it is commonly accessible. All I have to do is to point out how it is a dog whistle, and a quick Google will confirm that yes, this is something Nazis do. The average person doesn't need to know in advance. They can check.
They going to listen to you? Like,
If I punch a Nazi and then the police arrest me and then I have to have a trial, chances are I will get interviewed. Yes, I will get to have my say.
that's only if that's a popular Nazi. No, like if we
No,
punch a
not really. No, it is a good story that someone decided to assault a Nazi on the like when Richard Spencer got hit. How fucking viral did that go? Yes, he is popular. That's part of it, but it's not just that. It's also the fact that people liked watching it. People watched it and went, damn straight, motherfucker. I felt that. I would have given that hit. Like, people relate to that content. It's a good story. It's interesting. People are interested. Yeah, so it's like you're saying, like, when crimes happen to people who aren't famous, there's not reporting on it. There's shitloads of reporting on crime.
Okay, so I would say that story was only popular because, one, Richard Spencer is popular, and 2, everybody knows Richard Spencer is like a white nationalist asshole. When you're
Okay, let's take a different example.
there are probably hundreds of
Are you
stories.
familiar with the Antifa professor who hit someone in the face with a bike lock? That Nazi wasn't famous. How viral did that go? Pretty fucking viral.
Well, everybody knew that that guy was a Nazi based on what he did.
No, everybody knew he was a Nazi because an Antifa guy hit him in the face with a bike lock. That's why people knew he was a nobody. He was just at a rally. He wasn't a somebody dude. He was not famous. Neither was the Antifa professor famous. The very fact that it had happened was what people wanted to talk about.
All right. So, did the guy have a history of like being like a Nazi? Like if you did a search on him, would it be clear to him that it was a Nazi besides that story? Because I don't think if you hit like a random person who's spreading like Nazi rhetoric, that people aren't just going to assume he's a Nazi necessarily.
Yes, fucking are. Where are you getting off saying that? Of course they are. If you advocate for communism, I will think you are a communist. If you advocate for religion, I will think you are religious. If you advocate for the extermination of ethnic minorities, gay people, and mixed race people, I will think you are a Nazi.
In the scenario we've collectively agreed on, the person is not advocating for that. They
Yes,
are
but as I said in my opening,
arguments.
As I said in my opening statement, in order for it to be justifiable to punch a Nazi, you have to have evidence that they really are a Nazi. Whether they are currently advocating for Nazism, I think, is irrelevant. You just have to be sure that, in fact, they do advocate for that, which you can know because either their speech or writing is on record, or they have adorned their body with something like a swastika or maybe the black sun, or there are a number of symbols that indicate allegiance towards these ideologies. And but even like leaving the symbolism aside, typically, when someone is a Nazi, they talk about it. It is on record. Whether they're talking about it now is beside the point.
I just think it makes your position look weaker in the eyes of the public, no matter if you prove you're a Nazi or not.
Yeah, I think we disagree on that. I mean, I'm happy to acknowledge that you think that, but I don't think you've given much of an argument to persuade me or anybody in the audience. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the idea that, well, it just does do more harm than good, I feel like I have dispatched that handily.
Okay. So let's take a person who is common in society, right?
Just quickly.
I'll make this an example, right? Take Mark.
Just quickly though. How much time do we have?
Closing statements already? I
think.
Oh yeah. So, how much time, David?
Less than a minute.
Pardon?
Less than a minute. Like
left in the whole debate, or left before closing statements?
We should have already moved to closing statements, David.
Oh.
Well, no, because I think it should be, yeah, there's 10 minutes left in the debate now.
This is closing statement time.
Yeah. I just didn't want us to get into something we wouldn't be able to end. So, since I started, you can give your closing statement first.
All right. So, overall, there exists some justifications for enacting vigilante justice against Nazis. However, these Nazis will use this rhetoric in a way to weaken your position and strengthen theirs. They will make you look barbaric and unable to fight them with rational argument. They necessarily feed off people being irrational and doing to them to make their position look like the one that is trying to be oppressed. And yeah, that's my closing statement.
I mean, from my point of view, like, attempting to use rational argument to combat Nazism is just a non-starter. They just make fun of you, they laugh at you, they just flout the rules of dialogue to make you look like an idiot. Someone so obsessed with proving their point that you don't live in the real world. Like, you keep saying, you've said repeatedly throughout the debate that, like, doing this somehow buttresses Nazism, like that the hypocrisy or something of you hitting them like somehow validates their view. And I understand what you're saying there, but ultimately, like, principles are all good and well, but I live in the real world. If I have to compromise on my principles to survive and to ensure that my family survives, I fucking will. Okay, I think that, like, I think it would. I feel like we could have focused productively on the paradox of tolerance. I really think that this discussion revolves around that, because you essentially, actually, explicitly advocated for just ignoring them, which is to say, tolerating them. But if we tolerate ideas which are fundamentally intolerant, tolerance defeats itself. We have to draw the line somewhere, and I am drawing it here. Okay, as I said before, if the realization of another man's ideal would require the violent execution of my family, violently opposing his advocacy seems like a smart idea. And someone who the implementation of his vision for how the world should be would entail stripping me and mine of my human rights, I don't think that person gets human rights are reciprocal. It's a reciprocal thing. Social contract is reciprocal. If the other person in a discussion is advocating for like stripping away the human rights that protect me and my family, that allow us to speak freely. As far as I'm concerned, he has forfeited his right to safety, his right to freedom of speech. Ultimately, as I said, violence is always the final recourse when civilized methods of resolving a dispute have failed, and a preemptive strike can be a justified action in a situation where the intentions of a group are unambiguous, right? And finally, when it comes to the question of what kind of world you want to live in, or indeed when others are speaking of bringing about a world in which you would have no place, words have no traffic with our opponents because they value different things to us and therefore cannot be expected to compromise. Similarly, persuasion shall likely fail, and when civil discourse has no sway, we naturally default to violence, which is always the most effective and efficient way of quelling behavior we will not tolerate. We have always punished those who hold ideas which are pathologically antisocial, as in conspiracy to commit a crime, and I would argue this ought to be extended to ideologies which inevitably lead to human rights violations, war crimes, and other unspeakable acts against our fellow human being. Time. We can move to questions if you like.
I've got some questions in chat. One of them
You are very quiet for me, David. I don't know why.
Yeah, me too. I can't hear you.
Something could be wrong with my mic.
Yeah. I can't. If you want to type it in the chat, I could read it out, but I really can't hear you.
Yeah, that's super strange. Maybe if I close certain app.
Oh yeah.
Is that better?
There
Do
we
you
go.
hear me better?
Yeah.
Yeah, much
All right.
better.
So we have questions in the chat.
Yep.
Cooper asks a question for RevDev. Is it possible to simply ignore Nazis because punching them would make people who are deaf to their dog whistle more sympathetic to their cause? Then why can't we just ignore the same ignorant people who are and just punch the Nazi anyway, who ostensibly poses more of a threat than a non-Nazi who isn't even smart enough to recognize the Nazi? Why ignore actual Nazis but care about a hypothetical stupid person who would accidentally agree with one?
I don't think people are stupid for falling for dog whistles that seem plausible on their face. You got to realize that Nazi dog whistles aren't really that common in like the aggregate space of the space of discussion, right? So you punching them is just going to seem like a random dude who only knows how to argue with violence versus someone who's just saying facts about reality, or you. So that's my answer to that question.
Right. You can message, or you can even raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I think that would actually be fine. Be sure to tag me though. Somebody was requesting to speak, I think.
It's me. I'll let someone else ask. I just feel like I don't know if my question was directly addressed. And I would like to hear what InSync has to say as well. But what I'm trying to say is, if we can ignore Nazis, then why isn't ignoring people who aren't Nazis but could become Nazis also an option?
Because generally you want people that are not Nazis that but can become one to be persuaded to not become a Nazi. And if that's possible, then that would be a net benefit for society.
Yeah. And And, as to give my answer, I think that's exactly what I'm doing. I think, first of all, by punching the Nazi in the face, I'm providing a concrete example, a deterrent why you should not be a Nazi. And then, in my ability to articulate my reasons for why I assaulted this individual, I am able to speak to this potentially stupid person who might, in theory, agree with the Nazi and explain myself. And I am confident that although I can't win the war of words with the Nazi himself, to a Nazi sympathizer, my words will have a lot more weight.
Question by Cinder, not directed at any particular person. One, there's actually two questions. One, would you consider self-defense a violent action? Two, are we assuming everyone is as skilled at communicating as the speakers in the case of punching a Nazi?
In response to the first question, the answer is obviously yes. I mean, of course, self-defense is violence. No question about it. What else could it be? And as to the question about are we assuming, no, I'm not assuming everyone is as skilled at communicating as the speakers in this case. In fact, my argument really doesn't hinge on the efficacy of communication at all. I basically call that a lost cause. Trying to win the war of words with a Nazi is a waste of time. It's a non-starter. You're better off dealing with it in methods that are more consistent with the ideology.
Okay, my response to be one, yes, self-defense is a violent action, and two, no, but not everyone has to try to argue with the Nazi. They just have to necessarily speak out against. They have to make that position more amicable to a non-Nazi position than to a Nazi position.
So Terence asked a question. I think he's asking me, so I'll just answer it. If the Nazi is carrying a child with him, is it okay to punch him then? No. Pick another time. Is it worth it to punch a Nazi and both of you go to jail? Yes. And is it okay to punch Kanye West, given what we know about him? Probably not. So far, what I've seen of Kanye West has essentially been him talking about the Jewish question, but he doesn't seem to be. I mean, he's black, first of all, but but it doesn't seem to me that he's actually a Nazi. So yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get the people who wanted to speak on the stage on.
I had
So
I have joined a bit late, but I had a question for
Loud, are you there?
Yeah, he's talking. Can you not
yes,
hear him?
talking.
No, I can't hear him.
Yeah, I can
let me
hear him.
go.
I kind of joined in late, right? So I didn't really kind of hear perhaps what I consider a chunk of Rev's arguments and yours too. But I had a question for specifically that came to mind when I looked at this question that we had, which is this would be to you for NSYNC, right? That would you consider this in the context of where the Nazi themselves, right, are not being kind of violent, let's say physically? Is it really permissible, right, to engage, or is that kind of a social norm we should have in our society, to engage in physical violent behavior, right, to a political discussion that is largely or entirely verbal?
Yeah, so I sort of made an analogy to begin with, and I repeated it during my argument, but I made it in my opening statement as well. I made an analogy to conspiracy to commit a crime, right? So we already punish people just for words, okay? Conspiracy to commit a crime is itself a crime. Talking about the fact that you're planning to go and rob someone is a crime. The fact that it's just words doesn't matter.
No, yes, we should and we shouldn't tolerate it. Let's be clear, right? I believe we shouldn't tolerate it, but that doesn't mean that we should engage in physical violence.
Well, I think the answer to the question is yes. I think it's permissible.
Yes,
I mean,
so
for
I
the
like because I agree not tolerating it, right? But when in the sphere, right, the public sphere of which political discussions arise, right? Um, is that in terms of it being kind of behavior? Is that something that should be kind of normalized? Or is physical violence something that we should have normalized, or and do you fear that advocating right for physical violence, perhaps against specific select against people with select political ideologies, right, is kind of really true to our kind of a current political system?
I acknowledge it, that there's something seemingly problematic about it, but this is just the paradox of tolerance, right? Tolerance is a virtue. We shouldn't, in theory, use violence against other people who are
Yes,
just
we
using
shouldn't
words.
tolerate it. I agree with you, right?
No,
But
but what does it mean though, not to tolerate it though?
to specifically formulate right criticisms right that are informational, that appeal to facts, and you touched on that necessarily not being kind of, what I mean, the only mode of persuasion, and that's definitely true, right?
Well, I didn't appeal to it not being the only mode of persuasion. I suggested that against
Okay, so
someone
I feel like I'm going more into a debate with you. So
against someone who's playing an optics game, words don't work. So I don't see that as a viable means
I mean,
of.
no. Even if they are playing optics games,
Yeah, but come
Guys,
on,
we're not.
you're not here to debate it yourself. Okay,
yes, yes,
talk
I
about
I
it.
think,
don't think
We're just here
Talk
to
about it
ask
after the fact.
questions, and then we can
yeah.
Ask
do
question, get
debate
the answer,
after.
move on to the next question.
Yeah.
Come on,
Yeah,
David,
questions are
control it.
supposed to end.
I have a
Like,
question from Switch Drift, to InSync.
then that's the end.
If Nazis were being punched randomly, would you be concerned with Nazis becoming a protected class where they would get special consideration for police protection or special legal provisions? I cannot think of any, though.
It's a funny question, and interesting to consider. I mean, I would have to think more about it, but on the face of it, I would say no, because I just don't think people would. I don't think people would ever really think of Nazis as the kind of people that need protection, I guess.
Yeah, so my question is to Insync, right? I think you might be able to, I guess, sob story a situation in an interview. If someone's like got a pretty well-known history of like outward Nazism or is covered in swastikas, right? But it seems like in lieu of someone attaching the label or the pre-existing meme of Nazism explicitly, a lot of similar ideas can resurface effectively, almost indistinguishable from the old version, where you wouldn't be able to rely on, hey, this dude's a Nazi.
Yeah, I don't
as
care about
the
it.
get out of jail free card, right?
I don't care about it being specifically a Nazi. That's just the example we're using in this case. If someone's an advocate for an ideology which would entail the stripping of human rights from me and my family, I'm going to react the same way, no matter what the ideology is.
Okay. And then my second question is, I understand that you can't win a war of words with a bad faith actor who's willing to weaponize them as needed, but it seems like if they're doing an optics play, a suitable or sufficient form of violence might not be physical violence, but instead restrictions in terms of the political activities political positions these people could engage in, or the online platforms they could engage in. And this doesn't seem to necessitate physical violence in which to achieve the same, like, I guess, getting rid of the optics issue and providing some kind of significant deterrent. Wondering why you would allow for violence when there's another route that seemingly accomplishes the same goal.
Because for right now, we don't have such laws, and up until we do have such laws, I'm gonna still advocate for violence because it deals with the problem, and in the absence of a laws, we have to deal with it somehow. But I'd totally be in favor of the creation of laws to limit the power, the possible platforming of people who have such dangerous ideas. I think that's a secondary solution that could even come to replace. It could well be that solution would get so effective you would never need to punch a Nazi. But I stand by the fact that if it wasn't working and you did need to, you should.
Okay.
Okay, that's the end of questioning. And the judges have already reached a decision by a vote of 3-0. NSYNC defeats me.
It's a good discussion. Interesting experience. Honestly, Jack, this one made me move a little back towards my original position, because in order to win this one, I had to be much more dishonest than in the previous one. Yeah. So, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing for me to be. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it depends, right? How much does winning mean to you, right? That's that balancing act, right?
Well, no, I get that. That's what I'm saying is maybe it doesn't mean enough to me to think, like, I don't know. I felt a little dirty with how much I had to misrepresent my genuine views in this debate.
No, I know, I understand, but
No,
what I'm saying is
punch a
that
Nazi
there is
on the
another
debate.
approach wherein you don't engage in dishonesty and you try and pursue whatever possible, and
but
you
then I would.
lose, right? Like, you take the L, but like at the end of the day, if you care more about winning than the honesty, then you don't take the L.
Well, if I care more about, that's the thing is, if I care about winning and honesty, I could just try to avoid being put in a position where I have to argue for something I don't believe.
Like, we're going to move past it at this point. As a final statement, what I'll say is just that I think, categorically, hypocrisy is counterproductive.
Okay. I don't think I'll just say in my final statement then that I don't see it as hypocrisy to tell someone that's saying, hey, Spider Sutra, we should get the government to prevent you from speaking. I don't think it's counterproductive for me to, like,
say the government should stop you from saying
I'm a full-blown Nazi. How does that work?
Because the way they define it again is that it's for you're focusing on one group of people over another group of people. And the ones who call everyone else they don't like fascists, they're internationalist communists, and they want everybody to be in the utopia, not just a few people. It's not a complicated...
So, I do have to ask.
Traditional views on race. And then the JQ, or recognition of the JQ, is the third one, that if you deny any one of these three properties, the alt-right will oust you or claim you as being alt-light, you're cucking to the civic, you're not willing to go far enough into the deep end.
I wouldn't even add a fourth one, which is capitalism. If you're talking about the hard, not the alt-light, but